Somebody was just, in fact, somebody back there was just mentioning, who's the writer of Ecclesiastes? Solomon wrote it, and there's really no other, not even the liberal critics can doubt that. And what else did Solomon write?
Proverbs, Song of Solomon.
Proverbs, Song of Solomon. And Ecclesiastes is quite different from the book of Proverbs. Okay? Proverbs is full of wise sayings, whereas Ecclesiastes is full of foolishness. Can I say that?
Yeah.
And I'll explain that further. In many ways, Ecclesiastes is autobiographical. Because we know Solomon was a wise man, right? But did he make some mistakes? Yeah, he made a bunch of them. And he what? Okay. Well, I don't know about that. There might be a couple of good ones. What he had 1,000 wives and concubines? Yeah, he had a bunch of them. But Ecclesiastes comes from the origin of the word is actually Hebrew, and it's translated into the Latin and into the Greek in the same way. And from the Greek, it comes from the word ecclesia, okay, which is where we get the words assembly, congregation. It's even where we get the word pastor or preacher, okay? And in the Hebrew, the word that it comes from means to gather together, to speak to. And I have no idea how to pronounce the Hebrew word. Qoheleth. I ain't even going to try it. I've been trying to learn the words for the Seder meal. I'm so confused sometimes. But Ecclesiastes is a collection of 5 books that are called the 5 Scrolls. And included in that, there is Ruth, Song of Solomon, Esther, Lamentation, and Ecclesiastes. And these are 5 books that are actually read, just so happens, at the Passover, or during the Passover. So it kind of fits where we're at. So the word Ecclesiastes then indicates a preacher. Some would say it could even indicate a philosopher. Okay? And it would seem some of the writing might be philosophical in nature from the word, from the book of Ecclesiastes. And I want to, because I'm saying this, I want to explain it to you. I want to make sure you understand. It's important to understand when you look at books in the Bible, why were they written? All right? They all have a purpose behind them. And so before you really begin reading a book, you need to back up a little bit or back off a little bit and take a proper perspective of what the book is trying to tell you. It's kind of like the idea before you pull out the microscope, get the telescope, get the big picture, and then start taking apart the little pieces, okay? And that's very evident in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because in this writing, and I'm using J. Vernon McGee's outline, I won't use all of his material, but I will use his outline. In this writing, Solomon states a problem. What's the problem? What's the famous phrase from the book of Ecclesiastes?
Many
vanity. That's the problem. All is vanity. And then he lists all of these things, and there's a whole long list of them. It's like 12 chapters of it. He lists all these things that, and he tries to give a perspective. What are the importance of these things? Because ultimately, what's important? One thing, God. That's all that's important. And I think the last two verses kind of answer that question of the book. But Ecclesiastes is a favorite book of atheists. They like to quote it because they misquote it. Because they will say, well, Solomon said that. Well, that's not what Solomon said. See, they will take what Solomon said and twist it and use it to Voltaire, who's a very famous atheist, is one who did that in a lot of his writing. There's some cults that will use some of the writings from Ecclesiastes to base doctrine on. And the idea, a lot of what Solomon is speaking of is the idea that man has tried everything to be happy without God. Okay? And in many ways, this book will show the absurdity of that attempt. You know, here's Solomon, who's the wisest of men, and he was given, actually, God-given wisdom, okay? And he, it would seem, tried almost every endeavor of pleasure, okay? And still, he comes to a conclusion that it's all vanity. And what does vanity mean? Okay. Purposeless, can I say that? Purposeless. Empty might be an easy way. But satisfaction in life can never be achieved by the things that Solomon is going to show us. You know, God showed Job to be a righteous man. And Job was a righteous man, but he was still a sinner in the eyes of God, okay? In Ecclesiastes, you have a wise man, Solomon, who's still a fool in the eyes of God. And he lived his life that way at times. I want to look at his blessing from God and wisdom, because I do think that sometimes we take some of his wiseness to an extreme. But you know, we have a lot of people, you know, we have a, I shouldn't talk about this right now. We have a lot of people that have doctorates, degrees, and PhDs, and all that kind of stuff, who are very intellectual, and I'm not talking about Gordy, who think they have great wisdom. But, and you know, some of the most foolish people I've ever known are some of the most educated people I've ever known. When I think back, you know, when I was a school administrator, I used to go to these annual conventions, and I wasn't really that, my degree was never in school administration. But I would go to these, and some of these people they had PhDs in school administration. And I'd sit there at the meetings with them and stuff at the table, and they didn't have a lick of sense. You know, when it came to managing people and managing their schools, et cetera, et cetera. Not that I was that good, but still. But what Ecclesiastes says is that without God, there's no life satisfaction. Okay? That you cannot have a content heart without God. You know, in the Song of Solomon, you learn that if we turn from the world and set that we need to turn from the world and set our affections on Christ. Okay? And here in Ecclesiastes, we need to learn. We learn that to be truly wise is to know God. And the key word, of course, the word vanity appears 37 times in Ecclesiastes. And the key phrase is under the sun. Who's under the sun? Mankind. So when he writes that phrase, and he writes it a whole many 29 times. Every time he's saying that, when he says under the sun, he's saying us who are less than God. Okay? And then he'll say, another recurring phrase is, I said in my heart. Okay? So he's a man, so he's reflecting a man's heart when he says that. So this is not a book without rhyme or reason. It's not just a bunch of verses that have been stuck together. It begins with the problem, the vanity of the world. And then, for lack of a better phrase, we'll use the idea that vanity is then experimented on. And I've broken down in your outline, I've started to show you some of the things that this vanity will be experimented on. And Solomon will seek to, by looking at these different areas, such as science, wisdom and philosophy, etc., he will experiment with those issues to see how they stand up with his idea that everything is in vain if there is no God, okay? He's going to, in philosophy, you would say he's going to explore the areas of fatalism, egotism. He's going to look at religion. He's going to look at wealth, which he's very familiar with. He's going to look at morality. And then in that way, he'll look at he's going to draw conclusions. And his conclusions that he will pronounce, this is part of the problem when you quote from Ecclesiastes, the conclusions that he will pronounce, a lot of them are from a man's heart. He'll say that. From a man's heart, this is this and this is that. Well, what he's saying when he says that is that this is wrong when he says that. So you have to understand his writing technique to understand what he's trying to say, okay? This is a man under the sun. Same thing. This isn't what God says. See, a lot of people get confused when we say the Bible is written by inspiration, or the Bible is inspired by God. And what inspiration guarantees you is the accuracy of the words of Scripture. But just because it is inspired, the thought that is expressed is not always God's thought. Okay? Think of Judas. What were Judas's thoughts? Those weren't God's thoughts. Those were Satan's thoughts, in fact. So the statements that Solomon is, some of the statements he's going to make are statements that show his pursuit of satisfaction under the sun. And what happens? He ends up with nothing. Vanity. So, okay? So, 1:1. Open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes. And then, we'll look at 1:1. And when it says, the words of the preacher, that's in Ecclesia, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Okay? So, that's pretty obvious who wrote the book. David had other sons, but Solomon was the only one who was king of Jerusalem. And he's a preacher with the idea of the one who gathers people together. Some people would use the word philosopher because of this type of writing here. What do you have? So, go back to 1 Kings 3:9. Go back up to the left of about 5, 6 books, 7 books. I want you to look at 1 Kings 3:9. In 1 Kings 3:9, Solomon asks for, give to your servant an understanding heart. And why does he want an understanding heart? To judge the people. Okay? That I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to judge this great people of yours? And then continue, verse 10. The speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked for this thing. So God says to him, because you have asked for this thing, and have not asked for long life for yourself, nor have you asked for riches, or asked for the life of your enemies. You have asked for your self-understanding to discern what? Justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you that you have not asked both riches, etc., etc. One thing that Solomon was well known for was his ability to govern. He was a great leader of the people on the world stage. Okay? And that's a lot of where his wisdom went. You know, when these other kings like Sheba came to see him, they came to see how he was able to accumulate all his wealth. Okay? Yes, he was wise. He had a good understanding of good and evil. But it's important to understand, because you see so much of his, you know, we look at Solomon, that's one of the dichotomies is, okay, he's so wise, but he did all this stupid stuff. Well, he was wise about some things, but he wasn't real wise about other things, okay? So we have to keep that in mind. So, you know, because other leaders of the world actually came to study under Solomon. Kings would send their underlings, their court members, to come to Solomon's court to study underneath him. And the area of his greatest spiritual discernment was his ability to determine good from bad in regards to his leadership. So here, what we're going to see is in verse 2, he says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanities of vanities, all is vanities. So that's that idea. What was the word you used for vanity, Larry?
Absurdity, frustration.
Okay. Purposelessness. Is that a word? Purposelessness. Having no purpose. Okay. Life without purpose. And that's why I like the word empty. An empty life. What was my life before Christ? Empty. That's the only way I could think of it. It means to live life like an animal. Not like, like Snowbella. Most of you know Snowbella. She's the best dog in the whole world. So that's why most people know her.
That is Cookie.
And Cookie. And they're tying her and Cookie. But, what does Snowbella know of the world? Her life, beyond wagging her little stubby tail, is pretty empty. She's not. And that's the way a life is without the Lord. I think in Proverbs, we get these little gems of wisdom. In Ecclesiastes, you get these sticky gobble, and they're not wisdom, they're folly. And as we begin to read some of this, you're going to see Solomon. I think he was an expert in wisdom, folliness, that's a word, and he was an expert in love. Well, he had to be. He had Solomon. Either that, or maybe that was part of his folly. Well, it was part of his folly. But I know a lot of people get on because he married all these women and had all these women. Well, a lot of them were because of political expedience. It helped continue his kingdom. Wise in government, but not wise about everything. So, you know, we need to look for revelation when we read this. And vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Life without God is a vanity. And so we're going to start talking about then verse 3. What does he say in 3? What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? Okay, and there again, under the sun, keeping in mind, when he speaks of under the sun, that's from man's point of view. Okay, so if he says under the sun, that's man's point of view. So, from verse 4 now, all the way through 12:12, he's going to show this folliness, this vanity. And he's going to talk first about the laws of nature, science, for lack of a better term. Science, as scientific as one could be at that time. And he begins in verse 4, where he says, one generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. And the earth, as he sees it, is stable, and we are temporary. We come and we go, and even today, man used to live a long time, and then man, for centuries and centuries and centuries, his lifespan decreased. Now his lifespan's increasing. But man is temporary. But the earth, from man's point of view, is permanent. Okay, just ask some of the environmentalists. That's why you have to be so concerned about protecting it, because if you mess it up, you're never going to get a new one. Well, the problem is we are going to get a new one. But so Solomon makes this observation: from one generation to another, they pass away. Man's a transitory creature, and that's not folly. It's a good thought. There's trees in California older than most people. Those redwoods, all that kind of stuff. So, but for man often thinks, man often acts like he's going to live forever, that he has no worries. So now, look at what he begins in verse 5. This is where the real science. So he says, the sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. I read a commentary by Dr. Arthur Pearson, and he says this: there is danger in pressing the words in the Bible into a positive announcement of scientific fact. I wouldn't say there's any danger in that. I think when the Bible addresses science, it's totally accurate. But that's his words. But he says, so marvelous are its correspondences. In other words, he says, there is a lot of legitimacy to it. So it is a curious fact that Solomon should use language entirely consistent with discoveries such as evaporation and storm currents. Some have boldly said that Redfield is a scientist who had a lot to do with the forming of storms. He had a theory about the forming of storms. Some have boldly stated that Redfield's theory is explicitly stated here. I don't know about explicit. But Solomon taught and used terms that accommodate the facts about the movement of the winds and other nature-type related incidences. And he talks about evaporation, waters that fall on the earth continually rising again. In fact, later it'll talk about, I think it's all the way over in 12. Get 12 real quick, just turn over. 12:6. Oh yeah. 12:6, remember your creator before the silver cord is loosed. Some people take the silver cord as being the spinal cord. So some people take that verse as read down that verse as a description of death. But and I don't know about that, but still. So there's this explanation of how a lot of these things work, and the sun rises and the sun goes down. In other words, he almost speaks about the monotony of nature. But even though it's monotonous, you can count on it. When we go to sleep tonight, we expect the sun to come up in the morning. And we know the sun is really, the sun coming up is caused by not the movement of the sun, by the rotation of the earth, okay? So a good explanation of the way the sun appears and disappears. He talks about the wind going to the south, and then it comes from the north, and we do now understand, probably in the last, 100 years or so, we understand more and more about wind patterns, wind currents, how they impact our weather to an extreme amount. What is it in John? It talks about, the wind blows, but you can't tell where it's coming from, and you can't tell where it's going, but the wind does blow. So Solomon's, the wind goes south and it turns to the north, and et cetera, et cetera. He talks then, verse 7, all the rivers run into the sea. Okay, right? All the rivers run into the sea. So how come the sea's not full? Because it evaporates. That's why the sea doesn't fill up. So he kind of gives an explanation for evaporation. He doesn't use the word evaporation because they didn't have a word for evaporation. But the wind comes along and blows that moist air in the sea over the land, and what happens? It produces clouds. And then what happens? It rains, and the water goes back into the sea, and it's a big cycle. And when you include verse 4, you have really 4 statements there of kind of scientific ideas. But then look at what he says in verse 8. All things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, and the ear isn't filled with hearing. Now, that probably wasn't quite as obvious in Solomon's time as it is today. But I remember when I was young, many years ago, televisions. You remember televisions when you were young? They don't look like they look like today. And when television came out, it was the greatest thing in the world, for some people. And people said, wow, there'll never be anything any better than television. So what now? So then we come to computers. And the idea is that all things are full of labor. Man, the eye is not satisfied with what it sees. So then you get to computers. Oh, computers, man, that's the greatest thing in the world. They're, we've got all these computers. But what's happening now? Well, you used to have if you go into an electronics store, like Big Box, what is it called? The one in Sierra Vista? Best Buy. Big Box. Yeah, that's the name of it, the Big Box store. You go in there and look at the hard drives. They got a little itty bitty section of hard drives. They got a little bit bigger section of laptops, and then they got all these pads and notebooks and all that stuff and all that stuff, And now Apple just came out with a computer watch, So there is no matter what man has, he's not satisfied except for one thing, and that's the satisfaction that God can give you. And then if you can hang on to that satisfaction, you don't need some of these other things quite as much. But man in his desire to enjoy life is always after the bigger, better thing. And, like we started in, 1960 something to really explore outer space. We were, and, there were scientists that said, well, we're going to explore the entire universe. Well, how's that working out? We're not doing real good at that. I don't even know if have we had an object leave the solar system yet? I don't know if we have. We may have some that may have gone, but the thing is about man, the more we learn, the more we figure we find out we don't know. So there's a continual, so that's part of the vanity of man. We always think that we've got the answer. The problem is that we never have the answer. We cannot comprehend the things of the universe. We're kind of like the dog. When the dog howls at the moon, what's he doing? Measuring the distance? No. He's just howling at the moon because the moon's there. Well, that's kind of how we are. We haven't got a clue, but we think we do. I don't know. I used to watch Carl Sagan when I was younger. I was fascinated by that whole idea of some of the things he talked about. But he didn't have. You go back and look at some of that stuff now. It's a bunch of poppycock. But he was the smartest man on earth when he was saying all of that. Him and what's his name? Live long and prosper. Him and Leonard Nimoy, Dr. Spock. They were the two smartest guys on earth. So, but we don't have anything. But our eyes and our ears are never satisfied. Man always wants more. And then in verses 9 and 10, that which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. I'm kind of almost poetic. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been done in ancient times before us. Okay? People, we like to think it's something new. They make a new gadget, but the new gadgets they might be new gadgets, but they satisfy the same basic urges of mankind. They gratify the same feeling. So there is really nothing new under the sun. Okay? But the search of something new under the sun is vain. It's empty. There's nothing there for us. And they may change the setting. It might not look the same, but it's still the same thing. There's one, although there is one, and like I said, there's one exception to that. The only really new thing in your life is the new birth. Now that is new. When you're newly born by Jesus Christ, that is new. That's totally unique and that's new. So that's the newest thing you can get. So, and then in 11 he talks about no remembrance of former things. The things that were important to me when I was 17 or 18, I don't even remember most of the things. The songs that were important to me, I don't remember a lot of those songs. Who was president 50 years ago? Maybe Eisenhower, yeah, maybe. The remembrance of things isn't as important as what we're doing today with our lives today, okay? And then I'll just spend another minute or two. So then he kind of changes his perspective, and in verse 12, and then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly, and I'm on the wrong chapter. In verse 12, he describes himself again as a preacher. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be, he says, exercised. So, Solomon was a very philosophical man. He was known to have studied the great thinkers of his time and those that preceded him. And he lived, Solomon lived 1,000 years before Christ. Yeah, over 3,000 years ago. But the thing is, if you look at any of the popular philosophy of the day, none of it's new. It's the same old thing. Because who is the initiator of those philosophies? Mankind. Mankind ain't got a new thought. It really doesn't. God is the only initiator of new thought when you come to know Him as your Lord and Savior. But there is no new wisdom. There is no new satisfaction. Without God, everything is vain. And He says, I have seen all the works that were done under the sun, and behold, it's all vanity, He says. You can, and there's people that do that. I remember some of my college professors, and they were still going to school, pursuing knowledge. They were in the continual pursuit of knowledge. And I didn't think they had a lick of knowledge when it came to the important things. But, I'll get on a soapbox real quick. Just look at the educational system in our country. Just look where we're at, and you can ask a college professor, and they'll tell you how much better education is today than it used to be. There's so much time spent on things of unimportance that the important things get very little time. In philosophy and psychology, see, man wants to take philosophy and psychology and change the nature of man. Can't happen. There's only one thing that can change the nature of man, and that's God. You cannot, that's how these guys get up and say, well, we're going to have world peace. You cannot change man's nature. The only way to change man, and we are going to have world peace, but we're going to have a lot of issues before we get to world peace. The world makes so little sense. I'm going to stop here. I'm just going to get on my soapbox real quick. I saw a thing. Well, there's this thing at this college where they don't want to fly the American flag because it's a symbol of hatred. And then there was a demonstration in Mexico City by Central Americans who were protesting that it was too hard to sneak into America. And they wanted the American government to make it easier. They were having a big protest. And that's just how backwards the world is. Everything's backwards. Everything's backwards. I don't know. Come again, Lord Jesus. That's all I can say.
Hurry.
Okay, any comments?
I'm getting ahead with this, but I love when someone says, with much wisdom, there's much sorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it breaks your heart. And when you really understand the condition of humanity, it should break your heart because it's terrible what the condition we're in. Okay. Come on. Any comments? Anybody? Anybody else?